Hello, everyone. So we just kicked off the start of the live session. We're going to wait a minute and a half before we get going because typically people kind of rush in when their calendar invites go off. So we'll give it a couple seconds, a minute, and then we'll kick things off there.
I am going to turn my phone off so it doesn't blow up in the middle, which is probably a good idea. But where are you tuning in from, Dan? I don't know where you are nowadays.
Well, Waterloo, so near Toronto.
Okay.
Yep. And you're still
in sunny Wisconsin.
Wisconsin, yep.
It's a chilly day today.
Mm-hmm. So what's interesting when we have webinars like this, usually we're the farthest north, but I think you're actually almost farther north than we are.
Yeah, it's pretty close, right? It's weird. It's a weird border right there, but yeah, I'm just waiting for the snow, but just cold for us right now.
Yeah, we had one day of nasty snow so far, but other than that, it's been okay.
It's coming.
All right, I think we'll get going. That's given everybody a week or so of a minute or so of time to come in. I think I need more coffee today. So thanks everybody for joining. So today, Simon and I are going to be talking about hybrid networks. I tend to say multi-access network and hybrid network a little bit interchangeably. So if I do that, please forgive me as we go through. Maybe it's a bit of a bad habit. But today we're going to be talking again an overall introduction to the problem around hybrid networks, some of the challenges that are there, and then a bit of the scaling problems that come with multi-access hybrid networks. And maybe unsurprisingly for those of you in larger organizations, this turns out to be mostly a kind of a people problem. So we'll talk a little bit about how we can help mitigate some of that and have some discussion after that as well. So just looking at the list of attendees, it looks like we have some Sonar customers, some Preseem customers, some names I recognize and some I don't. So it looks like we got a really good mix here today. So maybe we'll lead in with intros. I'll kick it off for anybody that just happens to not know Preseem and myself. So my name is Dan Siemon, CPO and co-founder of Preseem. History-wise, I've worked with ISPs pretty much my whole life, from owning a small ISP to working as a network admin to working in a network equipment provider for like the really big guys like Comcast, and then now, of course, with Preseem. And if you don't know Preseem, we're basically focused on measuring and improving quality of experience for local and regional internet providers. And that's basically where all our effort goes. And we're going to touch on little bits of that today, but we're not in any way trying to do product demos or anything like that in this session. And Simon, how are you?
Good. So I, similarly to Dan, been in the ISP industry pretty much my whole adult life. Started at Time Warner Cable 23 years ago now or something, doing tech support, and worked at small WISPs and done a variety of different things. But today I'm the CEO of Sonar, which is an OSS and BSS platform for ISPs, and happy to say I think we've been integrated with Preseem and working with you guys pretty much since you came onto the market, right?
Yeah, definitely. It was one of our first integrations and certainly one of the most successful, for sure.
Yeah, and we love you guys. I'll throw that out there.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to ask the most important question of the webinar. What is with the lights behind you?
Well, they're partially broken right now because I've been too lazy to fix them. But back when, it must have been before COVID, I think everyone started getting on Zoom. Before there was virtual backgrounds, I had this all set up. So the lights used to be hooked up to my audio, so when other people spoke, they lit up. But they're lighting up for me right now. But once everyone started doing the virtual backgrounds, they all assumed this was some, fake Zoom background. But no, I really do have stickers and lights all over my wall.
You just did it the hard way.
Yeah, exactly.
Very cool. Awesome. I guess maybe a little bit of a logistics for everybody. Feel free to ask questions. So there's a public chat channel. Anything that comes to mind you'd like us to talk about, ask as we go, as we're presenting and as we're discussing. Hopefully we can keep this a little bit interactive. Maybe we'll save a couple things to the end where we have some time for questions, but yeah, feel free to ask and we'll try to dig into things as we go. So some of the challenges around hybrid networks, and this is an area I think where both of us focus a lot of effort on, because it's definitely a big problem for especially service providers as they get bigger. So I thought I'd start by kind of motivating the problem a little bit. Oops, sorry. This thing's advancing too fast on me. Start by motivating the problem a little bit, and then we can have a bit of a discussion around that. So if you think about an access network where you just have a single vendor or a single access technology, I've chosen to kind of illustrate that with fixed wireless and Cambium there at the top. This is a world where the business can have essentially leverage the vendor tool for all the kind of provisioning and technical support needs. So an admin could go in there and provision a new subscriber. A support user could go in and kind of learn the pattern of what a good subscriber looks like, and figure out if they need to, how they can help the customers. Is everything working properly? And this is tractable with one. But typically what happens is you quickly kind of move into this multi-vendor world. And we'll talk a little bit about that on subsequent slides as well. But now the situation is that all those team members, those kind of semi-technical team members, admin provisioning, and to some extent the L1 support, they need to become masters of multiple tools. In this case, the Cambium UI, the Ubiquiti UI. And this starts to get pretty painful, both from a training perspective and a accuracy perspective, and all those kind of business process type problems. And where this leads logically, especially today when we have everybody basically going, or many ISPs going to multi-access networks, is a situation where you have multiple access technologies and multiple vendors in each access technology. And once you get to this place, it's really just not practical to leverage the individual vendor tools for kind of day-to-day tasks like provisioning and to some extent to a lot of extent, the first level support. Onboarding a new L1 person and expecting them to become masters of Cambium, Ubiquiti, Calyx, Adtran, Cisco, and Aris in a reasonable time frame is just not something that's practical, let alone all the specific expertise you have where, fixed wireless, you need to have your RF person, fiber, you need to have your splicer person. Just not really practical to kind of understand that all the way through. And this is going to be the problem we're going to talk about at a really high level of how to kind of abstract and make this possible for the organization to scale without expecting everybody to learn everything all the way up and down the stack. An interesting part of this is in a multi-access or a hybrid world, it almost equates equally with a multi-vendor network. And I think that's because there's really no equipment vendors that I know of that provide best of breed across all access technologies. So if you're going to have multiple access technologies, you're almost certainly going to have multiple vendors, multiple equipment vendors. And that's a good thing, right? Like you want to be able to choose the best product for the given problem. You even want to be able to choose the best access technology for a given problem. There might be a town you're overbuilding where fiber makes sense, and a more rural area where fixed wireless makes sense, or maybe a high density AP and a low density AP. Having that flexibility to be able to choose the right vendor and the right tool is really, really useful. It also gives you more power in terms of negotiation and adopting new technologies from like a supply chain problem perspective as well. If the provisioning people need to learn a new tool, that's going to put a big barrier to rolling these kind of new tools and new products into the business. But if you've got multi-vendors, you've got new complexity, you've got new problems, and how can the business scale to control that complexity? Simon, I don't know if there's anything you want to add onto there before we kind of go into some of the, from your experience, how we go into some of the solutions?
Yeah, I was just thinking it was interesting you brought up about the multi-vendor thing, because that is a lot of this, really, right? Mm-hmm. Like in a lot of cases, it doesn't matter that much how you're delivering it. It's all the different vendors that really create the issues. And it was actually just making me think, not that I plan to plug this here, but about your document you send out. Is it yearly you do that state of the...
Yeah, the fixed wireless support. Actually, there's a new one in 2 weeks. Yeah.
Is there? Yeah, because it's always interesting to see there the growth of different vendors. And I think really even with all ISPs we work with that would describe themselves as purely wireless, I can't think of many at all that are only using one vendor there. Mm-hmm. Even just for the delivery technology, right? Not even talking about backhauls and stuff. But
right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I ran into a customer at a show in the summer, and he was talking about one of the vendors' management platforms on the fiber side, and it looks really cool. Like that looks like a really good platform. He's like, "Oh yeah, but for historical reasons, I have some zone fiber, I have some Calyx, I have some Adtran, I have some on and on and on and on. So
Yeah.
that thing can't actually solve my problem." And I thought this was a really interesting comment, and it kind of informed a little bit of thinking on this.
Yeah, I think it's very true. All right, well, I could talk about this all day, but probably better keep going.
Cool. So this slide's going to maybe betray my background a little bit too much, that I'm a networking guy and a software guy. So I tend to think in layers. But I think it's useful to kind of to think about it like this, because it can kind of draw some abstraction points where different parts of the organization need to know different things. So if we take it from the bottom up, if you've got a Cambium in your network, you have to have a Cambium expert. If you've got Calyx in your network, you have to have a Calyx network. Similarly, you got to have that fiber splicer and fiber and the RF guy and fixed wireless. But that doesn't mean that you want to have any of that knowledge all the way to the provisioning and the business side. Those two things can be firewalled off. Obviously, the packages, services, IP assignments, ticket workflows, all the stuff that Sonar excels at is in that top layer of the BSS and OSS. And where we try to help is providing this kind of network quality layer across all of the different access technologies, so that the people more on the business side can focus on, are we actually delivering what our customers expect? It doesn't really matter to some extent whether it's fiber or fixed wireless or what the underlying infrastructure is. If we're able to deliver what they expect, then we can use that as the kind of forcing function at the top, while the technical people can focus on the details underneath. Because really, the great thing about the internet is, we're all delivering IP packets. It's kind of a similar service, and it just doesn't matter a ton, other than some benefits to fiber, et cetera. But it doesn't matter a ton what the underlying service is. If people are getting what they want, that's what the business cares about, and we try to provide a bit of that kind of network quality of abstraction there.
Yeah.
So Simon, if you want to talk a little bit about BSS and OS, certainly your area of expertise.
Yeah, for sure. So I think one of the things on the last slide you had at the top there was monitoring, and that's something that we're seeing a lot of change in. I mean, over the last few years, but especially now, right? There's this big push to get away from SNMP. I think pretty much every vendor either has some kind of proprietary monitoring mechanism now, or they're embracing something new that's more stream-based. But I think when you look at the provisioning side of this, as you mentioned, from a customer facing perspective, the monitoring is just as important. And I want to come out today and say there's nothing wrong with SNMP for most networks, right? I think the problem being solved with a lot of the streaming protocols for monitoring are designed for, AT&T, Comcast, very, very big providers that struggle with that. But getting a single pane of glass where you can look at all of that data and having it all accessible to your support people is critical. And they're really everything supports SNMP, right? Although I'm sure somebody's going to put in chat some piece of equipment they have that doesn't, but well, it's pretty ubiquitous.
Yeah, we could probably share some war stories with certain AP vendors that don't expose very much out of SNMP. But I think your point on where that streaming stuff is valuable is right on too. Like, if you're Comcast and you've got a data team and you've got data centers, and all that streaming telemetry can be really useful, but it's hard to make use of if you don't have that kind of large team to build around it. Like, it's not I don't know how to say that. It's not a solution. It's a data source. You have to build the solution on top, and that's doesn't always fit smaller providers.
Yeah, and I think at a very big scale, polling and stuff gets painful, and if you're solving for Google or somebody, right, then I can see it makes sense. But the reality is most of the gear you have today is going to be SNMP or nothing, right, or SNMP and something proprietary. And so, getting it all together is pretty important. And I think that ties into the service provisioning piece too. So, even looking at the multi-vendor setup before we even get into multi-delivery mechanisms, being able to pull that service provisioning back into the network and be able to let your support people and people that are answering the phone and dealing with customer problems not have to think very much about how the service is getting there, right, is a big thing. Or even not it doesn't have to be a technical support issue. If someone's upgrading their service plan, you don't want to have to worry too much about how you're getting data to them, right, and how that's being delivered. So I think in a case, somebody using Preseem as an example, right, you can have all of that rate limiting brought back into the network, so you're not having to focus on doing it at the edge. But there's a variety of different mechanisms there, and I think that's really the very important piece from my perspective, is that you're not reliant on the vendor providing you with some kind of mechanism to rate limit and then implementing that you already have that policy enforcement baked into the network. The other thing I'd throw on here as well is just this piece about APIs. I think you integrate with Sonar because we have a API, right? We do stuff back with you guys using your API. It's how everything's interconnected, and I would just say it's super important to be picking platforms to use that have strong APIs and a good commitment to that, because you're never going to get everything you need from everything, right? You're never going to be able to rely 100% on vendors to do everything for you. So having those APIs in place means you can differentiate yourself and, you know, pretty much do whatever you want if you're not able to get it elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. And I think you probably agree, like the vendor individual product tools are still necessary for kind of that low level debugging and stuff. It's the high level workflows that just don't make sense to kind of push right from the semi-technical people down.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's true in almost every case, right? Without naming any names, I'll try and be as vague as possible, but I think this is true kind of across the board in general, right? Is that most hardware vendors also produce some kind of management platform for their equipment. But it's, you know, it's always going to be either very, very expensive or do the bare minimum you need, or both. And yeah, you don't want to be having people log into that all the time. Like historically for me, when I was more focused on the network, I mean, I'm only ever really using those tools to troubleshoot. And to be honest, I rarely do that, because by the time the device isn't working, some management tool that's connected to that device all the way across the network probably isn't pulling data anymore or can't communicate. And, you know, I think most network guys, you end up getting into the gear and trying to figure out what's going on yourself, right? So, yeah, I mean, there's a time and a place for it, but not as a frontline system, I don't think. This one other piece I wanted to bring up on the OSS side is we talk a lot in these hybrid networks about provisioning, but I think the inventory and mapping side of this is super important as well, especially as you get into hybrid networks. There's a lot more to keep track of. So, for example, in Sonar, we have a lot of good geographical mapping, but we rely on third parties like Vitro for tracking things like splice locations, how many fibers are in a bundle, or, you know, whatever else you want to track there from a fiber perspective. And really having a good handle on that is super, super important. And then on the overall inventory side, IP assignment is something I think people lose sight of sometimes. Often when you've got a network that's using one type of technology, you can rely on a central DHCP server or something, right, to see how many IPs are actually in use, or who those IPs are assigned out to. But as you go into some of these other techs, you're often not using DHCP anymore. You have to assign IPs through some kind of configuration management or through a vendor's API or some other kind of mechanism. And so tracking that centrally is super important as well. And then you had mentioned the techs earlier, and I think that's a big thing that people don't think about as well. So as you get into those hybrid networks, can all your techs do everything? Probably not, especially not in the beginning. And I think this is probably more true for networks that are adding wireless than networks that are wireless adding other things. Can they climb, right? Do you have techs that can climb, and do you have techs that can splice? And so being able to track where they all are, but also what they can do, I think is a really important piece of this.
It's maybe a little in the weeds, but you mentioned the mapping integration. I'm kind of curious about that, because I suspect it's hard to communicate mapping details in an API that's agnostic. How what does that actually end up looking like practically, without anything too specific? But
yeah, so I think when you look at doing that in an agnostic way, I mean, there's really only a couple of different ways you can you can do it. So historically, there's things like KML, right, where there's some kind of export you can get with data in it. And now that you put me on the spot, I can't think of the name. I could probably go pull up our code and find it. But there is a standard now for encoding map locations in JSON,
Okay.
GeoJSON. That's what it's called. So we use that in Sonar to build all the data that we put on the maps, and we expose that as well. But that's another good way. I think being able to get at that data in that way is really helpful, because often you can see data in a map in all kinds of different tools, right? But being able to aggregate that together somewhere is really helpful. And KML has been that historically, but it's, you know, a bit Google specific. And so, yeah, GeoJSON. Glad I was able to scrape that out the back of my brain.
Yeah, interesting. It'd be worth looking at. The only experience I've had with KML was like overlay layers in Google Maps and stuff.
Yeah, yeah, which is mostly, I guess, what you're using it for generally, but at least as a display mechanism, and you know, it works.
Cool. Anything else you want to chat about on the OSS, BSS monitoring side?
No, I think I'm good. Let's
cool.
Keep on with the show.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier that we kind of focus on network quality is kind of this, trying to be this kind of layer between the technical people and the business side, so that, again, both sides don't need to know everything about each other in terms of like the operational processes like support, for example. And the way that we do that kind of has a top-down approach and kind of a bottom-up approach. So the top-down is we essentially look at the subscribers' traffic in an access agnostic way. So look at the latency, throughput, retransmissions, you know, all the stuff that kind of characterizes IP/transport layer performance. And then we tie that back into topology. Some of that topology we get with integrations with Sonar, and be able to identify which parts of the network are delivering a poor experience, which subscribers are getting a poor experience. And that's kind of this, very, very high level, top down look at the network of where the quality is. And then the other way that we go at this is a little more bottom up, extracting information from the network elements themselves. So if you want to be able to identify and understand the performance of an access point, you got to have RF parameters, for example. You're not going to get that out of the subscriber's traffic. So we'll pull all that kind of information out of there as well and build up kind of a model of what that particular access point is capable of in the fixed wireless case, for example. So you could, if you've seen our fixed wireless report that Simon mentioned earlier, that's kind of an example of that, where we can aggregate that data, understand the performance, and tie those two things together. And then we use that to drive things like scores, saying this particular access point is delivering a bad experience. The RF conditions in this access point is like a 3, it should be a 5, you know, those kind of simpler metrics. And again, the goal there is really to have this kind of abstraction of quality that doesn't have as all the details all the way up the stack to the support team. Hopefully eventually getting to that kind of dream world where the support team can say, all right, the quality's good, I don't need to look at the network, or the quality's bad, hey, network team, you get a ticket, I'm not dealing with this anymore. That's kind of the long-term goal, and we're getting closer to that.
I don't know, I think you can be pretty close today though, right? Now you say it's a dream world, but I mean, there are tools out there where you can get at least close to that level of visibility. I mean, to me, I think that's the most important thing, is to be able to empower those support people to look at something and see which way do I go, right? And again, not to just purely pimp Preseem here, but I feel okay doing it. But I mean, you do have that kind of visibility, right? And I think that's one of the powerful things about it.
That kind of fork in the road of, am I escalating this to the network team, or is this a problem with the subscriber? And answering that is definitely has value for sure.
Yeah.
And that's where generally where we try to focus is on that level. Cool. So I guess I talked a little bit about this in the previous slide, but kind of the way that this works at a high level is the admin, provisioning, and support teams can kind of focus more on that subscriber experience level. Of course, there's an overlap through the middle, and then the equipment metrics are really focused for L2, provisioning, figuring out what parts of the network you need to add capacity to, digging into individual low-level details and all that kind of stuff. So flows pretty much from the other slide, but I think it's important to kind of highlight where it's really a grayscale, right? You're always going to have some L1 person that wants to know the details, and you're going to, and vice versa from the bottom up. But being able to abstract that can certainly aid in training and make everything move a little faster. Simon touched on this a little bit earlier as well, of the complexity associated with implementing policies across multiple access technologies. The specific thing that we play in here is not on the provisioning side, in the sense of like turning up a fiber port or anything like that. That's not something that we're involved in at all. But in terms of actually just enforcing the plan rate, for example. So someone has a 30 meg plan. Doesn't really matter to us if that's on fixed wireless or if that's on fiber. We apply our same quality optimization techniques within that plan, which turns out to be surprisingly effective, because often people, their poor experience comes from self-congesting. It's not always a network problem. It certainly can be a network problem, but often it's self-congestion. And the main advantage of this is really just the ability to roll in new services quickly. So maybe examples of someone who couldn't get the APs they usually not buy in the last couple of years with all the supply chain problems. And if you don't have to directly integrate, you can just turn them up to a high rate and let something upstream do the plan creation, plan enforcement. It just makes it that much simpler to quickly roll in new products as well. So certainly from rolling out new products quickly, I think that this is a big benefit. But again, we don't really dig into the provisioning side. I know, so Simon, you've got integrations directly into some of those access technology equipment as well directly.
Yeah, we do. But even with that in place, the one thing I would say that I'm pretty sure you'd agree with is rate limiting is actually shockingly difficult, right? Like there's easy and hard ways to do it. And I think you guys do it a little harder way, but we've all played with tons of gear that allegedly rate limits, but does it horribly, right? Just starts dumping packets or makes for a really poor experience. And I think the piece of this that is the most important takeaway is moving that back upstream and not relying on the vendors. Because I feel about rate limiting in CPE in most cases the same way I feel about a lot of these management platforms. It's a bit of an afterthought, right? It's not that core mechanism, and they're probably just, I don't know what they're all using, but they're probably downloading TC and bundling it in and Googling how to configure it or something, right? And with the drive that there is nowadays for so many people to be working remotely, having that rate limiting work well, in the sense of not building a lot of self-congestion, is super important. Because if you're, think if we were on this session right now and my video started breaking up, I guarantee you half of the chat would be saying, get a new ISP, right? It doesn't matter what the root cause is. And really for the user as well, they're often sitting there struggling with real-time services not working well and saying, my ISP sucks. And it really is, in a lot of cases, just using too much data within the home, or the rate limiting algorithm being used is not good. So, we do have those connections there to provision that premise equipment, and we often are pushing people to do that. But yeah, I still would say rate limit well.
Yeah, and even from a consistency standpoint too, like if there's multiple vendors in the network, maybe one can do that well, but many can't. And then you've now got an inconsistency in behavior. And can the support guys recognize that or not? And are they sophisticated enough to? It's common. I often say, even when our software side, like consistency matters. Like it makes everything simpler.
Yeah, it does. And you got to think about what's the implication of what's being communicated there too, right? If you have equipment that when a customer's maxing out their connection makes everything unusable, and you expose that data to the support techs and they see it and say, well, you're maxing out your circuit, that's why it's behaving poorly, it's not actually really a helpful response, right? Like most consumers are not equipped to really deal with that, other than run around the house screaming at their kids to quit doing whatever they're doing and screaming at the wife to stop streaming in HD or whatever, right? So I think providing something there that is agnostic and abstract, but also is providing a good, solid service that's minimizing those frustrations is super important.
Yeah, we try. We probably don't have time today to get into the whole application agnostic or not argument, but and doing that in a way that doesn't mean writing a whole bunch of crazy rules for different protocols and all that. I sometimes joke that we're kind of like a veteran of the past DPI wars and not wanting to go back there again. So,
yeah. I mean, it was cool, right, for a little while, but
yeah.
I mean, now with TLS 1.3 and stuff too, it's getting harder and harder to do, and yeah, it's you're always playing catch up, I think, in that kind of scenario.
Yep. Great. All right. So I guess a couple of summary points before we kind of move into maybe a broader discussion or any questions that people have. So multi-access networks, as Simon said, like most of the customers we deal with are now if they don't already have 2-access technologies, they're looking at it. I think this is here to stay forever. Use the right tool for the right place. If you do have multi-access, you're definitely a multi-vendor network. I don't know of any vendor that really fills both of those. I know there's a couple that are going to try, but it's probably years out before that's even really a thing. And multi-vendor networks are good. Like, you want that flexibility. You want to be able to introduce new tools in your toolbox and solve supply chain problems and negotiate better or have the ability to negotiate harder when the time comes. But it really does bring complexity. Like every new piece of equipment, every new vendor is going to be new tools. So figure out ways to abstract that so the whole organization doesn't have to take on that complexity that's introduced really at the very bottom layer. So let's see what if we have anybody have any questions before we think about other areas to discuss here.
Got a couple.
Yeah, there's a question about the backhaul side. So that's maybe something you could talk about, Simon. We're focused very much on kind of the access edge. So we don't really do too much with backhaul radios. I don't know where you guys are with that right now.
Yeah, I mean, so I would say from a monitoring perspective, it falls in the same ballpark, right? Use SNMP, get it in a single pane of glass. I think at a high level with most backhauls, you're looking at the same kinds of things, right? You're looking at the quality of the connection, you're looking at the throughput, you're looking at packet drops and stuff like that. And most of that's pretty easy to pull in. I think the management side's harder. I know that was one of the questions here. I think that there's been a bit of a push over the last few years in the wireless industry, at least, to make automatic provisioning and management of CPE easier. And that hasn't really, in my experience, trickled down on the backhaul side, unfortunately. Although, that being said, I mean, I think there's less to do there, right? A lot of the time you set it up and you're away and gone. But the monitoring piece is, still super important, because I think, as you see, Dan, when you're dealing with this at the aggregation layer, keeping track of what's going on all the way through is really important from a support perspective. I mean, one bad link can create a lot of issues for clients. Do you guys see that, I guess, when you're looking at the statistics of a subscriber? I mean, if the AP or the whatever, DSLAM or whatever you're using is overloaded, you expose that. But if there's issues deeper in the network, is that still visible to you when you're looking at that data? Like if a backhaul is dropping packets?
It'll still be visible in the sense that the traffic will show that. Like, it's going to be lower throughput. Yeah. We're going to show retransmissions. We're going to show, depending on where it is, higher latency. But if we don't currently model like the whole topology, the mesh, I guess, all the way back to be able to break up where the problem is. So so we'd likely say, well, that this AP is getting, everybody there has 10% retransmissions TCP layer instead of 5. There's a problem, but if it's before us, we're not going to be able to say necessarily where before us.
Yeah, but you see the degradation.
Oh, right? Yeah, see the degradation. I mean, and sometimes it's even crazy things like bonded links that are configured for per packet load balancing instead of per flow load balancing. And that just shows up as like monster retransmission rates, which it's not good for the end host to have to reconstruct things out of order. And it's kind of one of those, nasty problems that's not very obvious.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I think, to answer that question to a degree then, right, the combination of having the monitoring all in one place and being able to see those stats, I think, can at least bring you to narrowing down the root cause, right? If you have good monitoring set up for your backhauls and you're getting notifications, the one is whatever, right? Bad signal quality or it's pinned or whatever. And you're also seeing in Preseem that customers are having a bad experience. I mean, you can probably put 2 and 2 together pretty quick.
Yeah, and I think, kind of alluding to what you're saying too, like the backhauls, they're a little bit simpler than multipoint. Like they can tell you really what's going on better than multipoints can, and there's fewer of them. So in general, I think they're just easier to deal with than all the multipoint APs that are out there in terms of labor and complexity.
Yeah.
Next question is, any plans for the quality monitoring to be compatible with KLX and other fiber setups? So we already have many customers that use us to do plan enforcement and quality of experience on other access technologies and fixed wireless. So cable, fiber, Ubiquiti, PON, that kind of stuff. What we don't have quite yet, and we're working on right now, is actually pulling in kind of some of those low-level information that we have for access points and showing that topology. So right now, people would kind of map those subscribers into our simple topology where it doesn't directly say like this is an OLT on this port, but that's something we're working on now. It's a big focus. I mean, it's pretty obvious this multi-access thing is here to stay, and we're spending a bunch of time on it.
Who are you seeing as the big players there right now on the fiber side, within your customer base at least?
So we have seen some Ubiquiti PON, maybe more than I would have guessed. I've never logged into it or used it. I can't really say anything about how good it is. And then beyond that, it's the obvious Adtran KLX.
Yeah, KLX seems to be the bigger one for us, but yeah, same kind of players.
Yeah, it seems like the two of them have, I mean, outside of the really big guys, like I was surprised actually when I was talking to the Nokia guys at one of the recent WISPA shows that they said they have more PON ports in the US than all of KLX and Adtran combined, I think is what the guy told me. But of course, I think they have Verizon as a customer site. So they kind of get like one and they just take over everything. But I didn't even realize that Nokia had that big of a PON product. Naive on my part. But.
Well, I think when you're, dealing with the Verizons and AT&T, I mean, I know even working at Time Warner, right, we looked at Cisco and Juniper and forget about the rest. It's just not worth the energy. So, we got to think of a way to advertise like that as well, though, where you just have that one thing that's an easy say, right? I don't know what it is yet, but that's good. Good for them.
Cool. Another question, will there be metrics to show unhappy connections? Yeah, so we're going to tie those back to individual PON ports and stuff. And I'm sure in Sonar now, you've got some PON metrics and things as well for probably for KLX.
Yeah, so we actually have an integration with KLX to do provisioning and monitoring. I think for other things, as long as it's exposed through SNMP, the thing with that actually is SNMP is the easy one, but we built a new polar, I don't know, maybe a year ago or something that can be extended to use other things. So I don't know if I need to feel too bad about saying like Ubiquiti's SNMP implementation is not very good. So I think for that one, we have something that'll SSH in and pull data. But then there's other things like MikroTik, where there's things that are easier to do through the API. We can pull that too. So we can use other mechanisms, but yeah. I mean, SNMP is the easy one, and we'll always pull stuff in through there if we can. So
we could probably have a fun webinar getting our development teams together to all complain about lack of SNMP and Ubiquiti together.
I think that ship's probably sailed. I don't think they're too concerned about changing that at this point. So yeah.
I mean, there is workarounds. It's just not as nice as it should be. So
no, but we've run into it a bit with some other stuff too, where there's just data that we wanted to pull that, I don't know if it's unreasonable to expect it to be an SNMP, but it was. And I think with Netonics, we had built something to SSH in and pull stuff from command line as well, because it does happen, right? I mean, there are those times where you want to get some real detailed info that just doesn't get exposed in SNMP for whatever reason. But thankfully, it's not too common.
Yeah. Great. Well, we're up at 40 minutes, which I think is kind of roughly our target for this. Does anybody have any questions or anything else? Simon, anything else you want to chat about?
I mean, the only thing I'd say that is just kind of interesting to me that's been happening recently, and I don't know how much you've been seeing it, but we're talking about these multi-access networks, and a lot of it is really talking about networks adding fiber, right, is often what we're hearing about. And I think the industry has grown up really fast the last couple of years. Specifically, we've been seeing a lot of private equity investment come in and either be looking to acquire ISPs or invest in them to build out these fiber networks. You seeing that kind of same thing in Canada, or is this a US thing at this point?
It's definitely here as well. I mean, the bulk of our customers are in the US, but we're definitely seeing it there as well. Like the acquisitions are happening. It's maybe even a little more pronounced in Canada at the moment. Just that, you know, population's smaller and still spread out pretty far. So taking out a few big guys can gobble up a lot of little guys and change the industry very dramatically, very quickly. Versus there's just so many more providers in the US that it's maybe a little less obvious how big of a trend that is, but it's definitely happening. Like we're seeing acquisitions, our customers buying other customers all the time.
Yeah. Well, I'll bring it up really just, I think, for people on this call, you know, if you're sitting there thinking about fiber and the cost is a pain point, right? I mean, there is cash out there now. There are people, I wouldn't say giving it away, but there's other options other than remortgaging your house and taking out yet another personal loan. So, yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it's take on a partner for that. The good thing about that is, yeah, I'm on the board of a small telco too, just as a side thing. And you know, once the fiber's in the ground, it's an asset that lasts a long time. Like once you get a few gigs into someone's house, or, you know, put 10 gig optics on it in the future, that's going to continue to pay back for quite some time. But certainly that upfront cost is non-trivial.
Yeah, it is. But there's also, I mean, I think there's some interesting approaches we've seen some of our customers do, like get fiber to a subdivision or something that's hard to get into, but use 60 gig to get the data to the actual houses, because the cost to get to the house is often pretty up there, right? But yeah, if you can deliver wirelessly there at a good speed, I think it's an interesting combo.
Yeah, we've seen a bit of the 60 gig, but not a ton. Have you seen it quite a bit recently?
Only for that kind of scenario, really. Okay. I think where in a big downtown area where you can kind of go from building to building easily, or that kind of subdivision distribution, because the distance is so short. But, you know, where it would be replaced with a short fiber run, I think there's a good play for it there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting seeing that, you know, gig and 2 gig on those mesh networks is pretty interesting for sure.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I don't think I see any more questions, and we're up at 45 minutes. So thank you everybody for joining. Hopefully everybody got a little bit out of this. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Simon or myself. We'd be happy to answer any other questions. If there's anything else we could do. And Simon, thanks for your time. It's always good to catch up and see if, you know, what we're all seeing, all the lines across the industry is always an interesting discussion.
Yeah. Thanks for inviting me. It's my first time to get out and talk to people for a little while. I've been cooped up in my basement here in the cold winter, so cool. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no, great. Thanks for your time, and thanks everybody for joining.
All right.
See you later.
See ya.